Hello, Cadre 2. Obviously, you can tell who this is. And once again, I haven't spent any time in a makeup room. You know that this is the way I really look, and there isn't much I can do about it. So, this is the first of probably four video vignettes about policy and politics and your leadership in it. And hopefully, they'll be relatively brief, probably 10-15 minutes. At the most, but you'll have a chance. Hope you'll have a chance to look at them before class in a couple of Sundays. The first video is about the policy cycle, and the policy cycle has to do with kind of a generic set of steps that policy formulation, policy development, policy implementation, and so forth goes through, regardless of whether you're talking about policy development at a local board level, in the legislature, by the governor, by the State Department of Education, state board, or even at the federal level. I'll try to outline those steps as clear as possible, and then talk to you a little bit about some of the things that tend to make a difference in that process. While I'm talking about it, I want you to see the diagram that I have made that talks about the policy cycle. And as you can see, beginning up there at awareness, sometimes awareness is created in a number of ways, and in Nebraska, one of the probably most effective ways that awareness of an issue, a policy issue, has come about is through what are called interim studies. The legislature every year takes on sometimes some controversial issues, and in order to not necessarily take them on in terms of passing a bill, they want to get it on the floor, get the conversation going, and then adopt a resolution that bill then be converted into an interim study, which means over the summer, either a group of people are commissioned to talk about this issue and study it, or someone is assigned the task of collecting some data or information about it, or something to that effect, somewhere in between. An example, usually when school finance is the issue, the education committee or a finance committee goes out, holds public hearings, asks people to come in, particularly superintendents of schools, to come in and talk about the school finance process so they can actually collect their information that way. A second way is through simply pulling some data together. It could be data about the need, could be data about what other states are doing. A good example is the bills this year on early childhood education was basically done by a staff member who was in the process of looking at what other states are doing, trying to find some reasonable models, and then there was some conversation about her findings with various individuals involved in early childhood education, either as providers or as consultants or as educators in those environments. So first one is a need, awareness of what the needs are, or awareness of what the issue is. The second step is then specifically taking that awareness and identifying exactly what the problem is. The problem is the lack of early childhood education. The problem is that the current school finance process virtually eliminates anyone from many school districts from receiving state aid, simply because the soaring land values that are out there makes them on paper look very rich, and when you look rich on paper, the state aid is going to diminish. The third step then is the articulation of outcome or possibilities, options, or alternatives. Sometimes that's a brainstorming process. Sometimes it's simply identifying two or three key kind of things that could be done. And then the next step is implementation of one of those outcomes or several of those outcomes. Then there's an evaluation, how did it work, and so forth. Usually those that begin with an interim study, the second year after the legislation has been put in place, the interim study group comes back together to look at the effects. Did it do what was desired or what was intended? And as a result, are there any fixes or tweaking that needs to be done to the original policy? And sometimes that evaluation piece creates a different level of awareness of the issue that was being addressed in the first place. And we'll get to a little bit more about the role that data and information plays in just a minute. Many times you can break that down into a 3-cycle or 3-stage kind of process. Let me show you what that would look like. Basically, this phase, these 2 phases of it, would be what's often called the agenda setting stage. In other words, finding the awareness, identifying the problem, and then this stage is called policy options. And this stage, and then implementation and feedback. The key to, I hope you're able to see that. If not, for some reason the computer went dark. But anyway, awareness and problem identification is usually an agenda setting stage, and then the identification of options and alternatives and policy options is the policy option stage, and then implementation and evaluation is implementation and feedback. So you can, however you want to look at it, either in a 6-stage model or in a 3-stage model that has a couple of different moving parts. I think the key to it is that it's a systems model. Almost nothing good comes out of policy that comes about as a result of a linear activity where there's an identification of need, there's an identification of policy alternatives, it's implemented, and then basically evaluated and forgotten about. Most good policy, and whether you like current school finance policy or not, you really can't argue with the fact that attempts have been made to make it more and more workable, more and more perfect in the sense of policy, simply because that cycle keeps going around and around in terms of evaluation or implementation and feedback back to, all right, are we aware of how this is really working and the effects that it's having on our schools and communities? And then again, looking at what are other policy options, and it goes around and around again. Now, at any point, I think some key points need to be made here. At any point, you could stick data into this. Ideally, you'd want data to be part of the awareness function, but often, this is kind of a general rule. Now, it isn't 100%, but policy-making bodies, whether they be local boards, state boards, legislatures, Congress, they tend to abhor data. In other words, they really don't want data, they reject data. What, in at least the initial stages, they tend to gravitate around are critical stories. That's why you, when the president gives his State of the Union message, he always tries to tell a story before he identifies what his agenda strategy is going to be. He uses someone in the military as he talks about benefits for military veterans coming home. He uses an individual on Social Security to talk about Social Security and the Affordable Care Act, and on and on and on, because the stories are very powerful. And so often the awareness is created by a story of how a particular policy is or is not affecting people. It's either positive or it's negative. And the more personal it is, or the more that the story is one that people can identify with, the more powerful it becomes in terms of getting this whole policy cycle started. Now, that doesn't mean that policymaking bodies don't want data, because once there's a story out there and this thing starts to move and identifying the problem, if I want to push this issue, then I'm going to look for data that pushes this issue. If I want to be opposed to this issue, then I'm going to look for data that opposes this issue. And that's exactly what's happening with the Affordable Care Act. And it's well underway in terms of being implemented, but it's still, there are still people back at the problem identification stage, and they want data on how many are going to be covered, how many of them would have been covered no matter what was done. Is it really reaching the people it was intended to? And so depending on what side of that fence that I'm on, I'm going to be looking for certain kinds of data. And that's usually when data becomes part of it, is when you really get down to either identifying the problem or pushing the problem down into the possibility of options or alternatives. and so forth. Obviously, data is collected on the feedback side when evaluation is done, but at least in the idea of setting an agenda, politicians tend to rally around stories because they're personal, they're usually up close, they're things that people can identify with, and rarely do policies that are based upon tons and tons of data tend to get started in the legislatures or in the policy-making bodies. Let me give you another example. The Affordable Care Act really didn't get started because there were so many people who did not have access to health care. Certainly that was one of the factors that moved the identification and definition of that problem further on, but it was the stories that talked about the divorced mother of three children who was working 2 or 3 jobs to put her, food on the table and to give her kids a good education, or the military veteran who, after coming home from the war, did not have access to the health care that he needed to have. And again, those personal stories, I think, is the key to it. So at any point along there, you could begin to add in data, depending upon how you want to begin to influence that cycle. If you want to influence it at what really is the problem, that's the time to introduce data that helps to identify it. If you're trying to then select strategies, that's the time to then introduce the data about what other states are doing or what other schools are doing. And then in the implementation and evaluation piece, collecting data about how's it going in year 1, how's it going in year 2, what have we accomplished in terms of being fidelity to the policy, and what have we accomplished in terms of what the intention or purpose of that policy was in the first place. For the most part, policies tend to neglect creating what I call an engagement plan, somewhere around identifying the options and alternatives to implementation, engaging people around the issue so that not only can you tell the story that creates the awareness, but you can present the data that helps you identify that problem. It is often a very effective way to get policy moving is to create an engagement plan. In other words, you go out and find out what people think, run it up on YouTube, put it on Facebook, hold hearings, public meetings, town hall meetings, and so forth about it. And so some kind of an engagement plan could be part of that policy cycle as well. I think when you get to the evaluation stage, the kind of feedback you want would best be described as being formative, and at 2 levels. One, how was the implementation done and how close to the purpose of the policy was that implemented? In other words, what's the fidelity of it? How close to the purpose and practices of that plan that are good practice or best practices, so to speak. Where advocacy fits in is any number of places. If you look at Voices for Children in Nebraska, it often is an advocacy piece for raising awareness. And one of the most interesting things that they do is both tell the story and give the data. When they talk about the number of single-parent families, they actually show a picture of a single-parent person trying to raise their children, taking them to school, taking them to various different activities and so forth, so that there's a story and a real face associated with it. And they've been fairly successful in raising awareness. However, what happens is they sometimes seem to drop off the radar screen when it gets around to more the identification of the problem and identification of the options, because they don't basically get into that for the most part. It's hard to say whether they'd be more effective, and I'm just using them as an example, and they're one of my favorite groups out there because of the way they tell the story about children. But think about the TV commercial where they show those kids in the third world country that are starving to death, and it would only take 75 cents a day to feed them 3 meals a day. That's telling the story and giving the data as well as to what could be done. One of the most interesting things that you could also put into this somewhere would be at the implementation phase, there's probably going to have to be some professional development in most education policies, learning how to do it, learning how to do what's intended, strategies for implementation, and so forth. So you could add a lot of things into the point is you could add a lot of things into this policy cycle, whether you talk about the three big buckets that are up